Good morning, everyone. I'm Simon.
I'm Matt.
We're from the Voxel Agents, as you said. We are a game development studio here in Melbourne. Been around for 10 years making our own independent games. And we're going to tell you a bit about how we made The Gardens Between. In particular, we're talking about how good design takes time. And we're going to go on a bit of a journey through that. So you might know us for The Gardens Between. We also made Train Conductor World and Puzzle Retreat. But we're going to start this morning with a story about Notre Dame and how design can go bad. In fact, catastrophic. So 6 months ago, one fine day, a security worker is in the command center where air samples from around the roof cavity of the Notre Dame are coming in. This really superior, technical solution to sample the air all comes into one command center, and suddenly a warning flashes up which says fire in French and the code ZDA 110.3.15.1, and the person quickly brings a security worker on the ground to go and check out where the fire is and find out what's going on. They get there and there's no fire, and so they quickly call the boss. The boss is not available for half an hour, doesn't call back for half an hour, and eventually when they do, they're like, you're actually looking in the wrong spot. That code means a different place. And so they run up to the top and they find the whole building's on fire, and if you didn't know, Notre Dame has unfortunately been severely burnt down. And this, for us, represents that technology can be amazing, but unless you spend the time to make sure that humans can use the system at the end of the day, it's pointless. And in this case, they didn't have an iteration on the user interface, and so some unsuspecting security worker reads the code and has no idea what the hell it means, and the whole thing burnt down. It's like one of the most important artifacts of our species. Anyway, so it burnt. And we're going to talk about The Gardens Between coming together, and it came together really well, but because we put it in front of users hundreds of times and thousands of people saw it before we finished, and it evolved and iterated over that time, iteration was absolutely critical to its success. And we're going to tell you the story of making it.
Yeah. So for those who don't know, The Gardens Between is a surreal puzzle adventure game. It follows the story of two best friends, their next door neighbors who run away from home and fall into a surreal world of garden islands. So each of these islands is kind of built up around objects that are important to the two characters, key moments from their friendship and growing up together. The goal on each of the islands is to collect the light, and you're taking it to the top to light beacons, which shoot in the sky and light up constellations, and that's how we kind of tell the story of their journey. But the trick in the game is you don't actually control the characters, you control time. You just move time backwards and forwards, solve puzzles, and go on this short narrative adventure with these two best friends. So looking back at the end, I think we actually surprised ourselves with how well it all fits together. There's all these little different parts that come together to make this a beautiful experience. So the light in the game is a metaphor for friendship, and the light in the game exists outside of time, like friendship exists outside of time. And time in our game is malleable, and memories are malleable. As you're talking with a friend, the memory of an experience can change. So they're traveling through these memories, preserving them together. And there's all these little bits that come together in this really beautiful way and mesh to make The Gardens Between a great experience. But we didn't design any of this. I don't think we could have at the start known how well this is all going to come together. It's just through a process of iteration that all these bits build and join together to build this beautiful product. And I think when you do spend this time and invest all this energy in making a game, people notice. So as was mentioned, we were on stage at WWDC recently to receive an Apple Design Award, which is a huge, incredible honor for us, and a really good experience. So but where did it all begin, Simon?
Good question, Matt. Let's go back to 2011 when we first started brainstorming new ideas. We're only about 2 years old as a studio, and as you can see on the board, there's lots of these different ideas that we'd come up with. One of them was the idea that we take the scene from Minority Report, where Tom Cruise is scrubbing through memories on the screen, going backwards and forwards in time to look for clues. And we thought that was really fascinating, and we came up with 5 different games in that year, completely different games built so that you could play them from start to finish. They're about 5 to 10 minutes each to play through, and they all take different aspects or different views on that one centralized concept of moving time backwards and forwards. None of them were completely resolved, and they weren't great games, but they were really interesting, and we were fascinated by it, and we could see that there was something there. Unfortunately, they were all huge. The scope of these was massive because it's all about the content and building these elaborate scenes and what's happening, and we just couldn't do it at that time. We knew that it was way beyond our capabilities. We couldn't fund it. So instead, we made this simple, logical puzzle game called Puzzle Retreat, and it wasn't until 2014 when we came back to it, Henrik Peterson came to us with the pitch, and he said, look, if we take that idea we prototyped of the time scrubbing mechanic, and we combine that with the minimal elegance of Journey, and we take the single screen logical puzzles of Monument Valley, we combine that together, I think we can do a really good job of telling an interesting story with cool gameplay. Both of those games have really beautiful art and great stories, and I think that they make really good combinations and could work well. Henrik Peterson is the leader of this project and went on to make the game. He is this is his baby, ultimately. We're telling the story in his place, to be clear. So those games and our game would follow these 4 key pillars of design. So we're respecting the player's time. We're building a game that is all about the quality and not the quantity. As we get a little bit older, we have less time, and many people do out there as well, and it's not about just keeping people entertained for as long as possible, but having the most concise and beautiful experience in a short period of time. Having careful and stress-free exploration, building a game without fail conditions, death, scoring, permanence, all these things that can be a little bit stressful, and trying to create peaceful and serene experiences. Crafting a genuine story that's personal, relatable, and about our own human experience. And finally, the highest level of accessibility, free from text or speech, limited or free of time pressure, and minimal controls are really intuitive and simple.
Yeah, so we had this idea and we're like, okay, so the key in making these games is obviously they're really beautiful. At this point, the team is just Henrik, a game designer, and Sam, a programmer. So how do we make all this pretty stuff? Well, we need an artist, so let's do an art jam. Let's just lock a bunch of artists in a room for a whole day and see what happens. This is one part talent scout for us and one part trying to define and find a style for the games. We're just trying to get a broad range of artistic styles and really lock in what we want to work with. To be clear, we did all pay them for the day's work as well.
And I'll point out, John there in the bottom right is the artist who went on to make the aesthetic of the game, and here's the genius behind the visual style.
So to set some guidelines and give some structure to this art jam, we decided to start with an experience that everyone in the room would be familiar with. So we chose fairy tales. So you can see Little Red Riding Hood, Snow White, Sleeping Beautiful Hair Dude, Hansel and Gretel. So all things that we all know, we kind of grew up with, but we wanted to tell different perspectives on these stories. So there's a few beautiful images came out of this. There's the big bad wolf and Little Red there on the horizon. So okay, so we've got a bit of a style and a story, and we want to have this time control mechanic. We have an artist now, so let's just mash these two ideas together and let's go to town on building a Red Riding Hood game, but putting our own stories in there. So we started with a bit of a prototype. At this point, it was a bit more of a hidden object game. So you could move time and follow different stories, and you were kind of searching for different objects within the levels. But it's really hard to build a hidden object game and experience that as a player without finalized art, because the art is such a critical component. So we actually ended up making pretty much a full prototype of this game. So there's multiple 10 chapters. As you're traveling through the experience and unlocking new chapters, you can unlock different perspectives. So while you can follow Little Red Riding Hood, she stays in the forest to pick flowers, you can see what the wolf's doing at the same time in the grandma's cabin. And this is really cool. It was actually a pretty fun, interesting experience. But could we make this into a full game? We weren't really sure. Is it a worthwhile investment that people would pay money for? And it also didn't really meet our design pillar goal of telling a genuine story that was unique to us. So in 2015, we started looking at how do you tell a good story? What makes a story worth telling? It needs to be personal and relatable. You have imperfect characters and a unique perspective. You don't want to just rehash something that's already been done. So we went back to the drawing board. We started putting together like a mood board for how we wanted the story to come together. So we're going to have these characters traveling through like these ancient worlds with timeless artifacts. We started looking at the types of characters that might inhabit this world. So like the frog deity there and the little ambassador to the Sea Kingdom and all these other different characters that might inhabit the world. And looking at how the game viewport might work in this space as well as you travel through these areas. But as we were building this, we wanted to tell this big adventure. But the story world kind of became too big. We're only 3 people at this point, a designer, an artist, and a programmer. We can't actually build worlds this big. So we actually ended up throwing like a lot of this art away. But we did learn huge amounts in the process. So like even the scaffolding and the waterfalls in this image, and this one as well, they kind of like probably the only things we kept from those images. But we just learned a lot about like storytelling and how to like combine these ancient artifacts and get little bits of old memories together. And as well, this is the first time where you can see the 2 characters and start getting a sense of their personalities. So Arena's the one in front. She's like the leader. She's standing upright. She's bold and striding ahead and leading the way. And then like Frank behind, he's running to catch up. He's really curious and getting distracted all the time. And you can start to see that in these images.
Okay, that takes us to our first prototype, where you can begin to see the connection between what we were making at the time and the final game that comes out. On the right, you have the Gardens Between as it stands today on the iPhone, and this is our prototype, which we called the Blue Mountain in 2015. We didn't know that it was going to be the same thing at the end, but you can see the parallels. And what's interesting here is that the form is this conical shape with a central spire and wrapping pathways around the conical shape going up to the top. And here, for us, the interesting thing is form is actually following the function. So let's talk about that. The biggest problem we had was that it was difficult to communicate that time is moving. And so we did all these prototypes to explore how you could show time moving with swipe gestures and like the time scrubbing mechanic that you saw earlier in other prototypes, having particles follow the finger and these like creatures that followed the finger and all kinds of stuff that like showed how you were manipulating time. But ultimately, what we settled on was this very intuitive way of doing it, which is simply the camera moves right when time is moving forward and the camera moves left when time is moving backward. Obviously, all things in the scene are also progressing the time, so object will fall down and reverse in the backwards direction. But that was enough to really show time moving forward. And the reason form follows function here is because the camera, when it rotates around a circular conical shape, the camera's changing a lot. So what is on screen is warping and changing, and you're seeing objects from different angles. By rotating the camera in that direction, you get a really interesting change of shape. And it looks great, and it also really helps to show that the camera is moving to the right. It also has lots of benefits, like the function of pathways wrapping around this shape now are stacked on top of each other. And so an object can be tall and touch 2 parts of the pathway, which is really interesting for gameplay because you have an overlap point where you can interact with it twice. And you can drop things from the top path to the bottom path and all kinds of stuff like that. It also has the benefit of having a focal point because it has a top. So, a big object at the top is the focal. Whereas all these benefits are lost in a horizontal long landscape. When you move the camera sideways, it's kind of like you're gliding past it. It's less intimate and less, like you get less awareness of the actual space itself when you just walk past it. It also supports our design pillar of stress-free exploration because you're able to condense the space into a smaller area. So by having it all overlapping, you can see all the puzzle elements on screen at once, which means you don't have to stress about, do I have all the information necessary to solve this puzzle? It's all right there, just kind of like the way Monument Valley has everything on a single screen. And there's other positive side effects that we didn't actually anticipate at the time. So for example, the feeling of a small intimate space is benefited by having a single large object in the center of a tiny little spire. Memories aren't 1,000-page stories like a Game of Thrones. That's not a memory. That's a story. Memories are fleeting, they're small, they're about a single moment. And by having a single object on top of the island, it has this more intimate sense of single memory. And secondly, the focus on the key object is really important for telling a story when you don't have any words or text. and you're trying to tell the story in a completely like minimal way. By having less, you're actually able to keep the player following along with with less information, so they follow each dot that you're laying out for them.
So here's a bit of a video from that prototype. There was actually 3 levels that you could play through. This is just the first level. But was that a success or was it a failure? There were lots of really good things about it. The gameplay was really engaging. The world was mysterious and compelling. People really wanted to see more and wanted to spend more time in the world and find out what it was about. But there were all these questions that came up. Why are there 2 characters? What's the point? Where are they going? How did they even get here? And then I guess from a dev perspective as well, it was also like really highly bespoke content. All the puzzles were really like unique and handcrafted. There was no like reuse of elements. So there was a few problems to overcome. So the first one, why are there 2 characters? I mean, in this prototype, they don't act differently. They move as a single unit. There's really no gameplay reason for them both to exist, which we don't like. We kind of think that like gameplay and story and everything should intermesh really nicely. So our solution was just give them different abilities, right? So give the friend character, the boy, some stone arm that does something and give them like very different unique personalities. So the bonus of this is if they have unique and specific moves, that means like specific repeatable abilities that they can use in the level, which means repeatable content. Like, hooray, video games. The second problem, what are they doing here? I don't understand the point. How'd they get here and where are they going? So at this point, we'd really nailed world building, I think. Like, people were really captivated by the world. There was no like story or cohesive structure or sense of like journey. So we started looking at how we can link all these spaces together and communicate like a larger sense of progress. So here's a couple of different examples that we were concepting for how to like have world building in the game. You can start to get a bit of a sense of like classic video game biomes. So you can have like an ice level and a water level. And we're looking at like different ways that we can like connect these level chunks together to like tell a broader story. But maybe there's another solution. Maybe we should just find someone who knows stories better than we do.
And there enters Brooke Maggs, the narrative designer of The Gardens Between, who helped shape what the game eventually becomes. Brooke brought the idea of this becoming a voyage and return storyline, best exemplified by Alice in Wonderland, where Alice falls into this surreal and strange world. Initially is quite interested by it, but eventually is chased out by the world and must return to the real world. So in our game, the characters start in the real world and they fall into this imaginary surreal space that represents their memories. Initially, they come across the green palette, which is the fascinating part, where they're fascinated by the world, it's really interesting, it's welcoming, and it's approachable. Then it starts to turn red and becomes frustrating, and things aren't quite going exactly as they hoped. Finally, it turns to the nightmare sequence, where it's a big stormy night, and they're beginning to be chased out by the world, and they start getting afraid and need to leave. It's all a metaphor for dealing with a difficult emotional event in your life. Initially, you begin to run away from it to try and pretend it doesn't exist, but eventually you need to come to terms with it, and that's when you are, once you've come to terms with it, you're ready to return to the real world and face your problem. And that's when the storm clears in the game, and I won't spoil the climactic ending, which you might already know the ending of. So in each of these islands, we have one central object that is from their key memories. In this case, there's a video game console that's at the top of the island, and that is from the day that they stayed indoors on a rainy day and played computer games together and formed a really important memory together that forms a significant part of their story. And from there, we were able to create the full skeleton of the structure of the story. And at this point, we had every single key beat of the narrative planned out, from the start of their friendship, the day they met, until the end of the story, that I won't, again, spoil. But you can see there's sequences here. And so the sequences have 3 key memories that form a progressing story towards a final culminating kind of moment. So in this case, on the left, there's the day that they were sawing bits of wood to prepare for their treehouse. In the middle, they're painting the wood and getting it ready to take up. And in the third case, they're actually building the treehouse and taking it to the top and putting it all together and then lifting things into their treehouse they've now built. And at the very end on the right, there's the little window into their lives, and that's actually kind of like a window into the real life moment where they were enjoying their treehouse for the first time. And there it is.
Cool. So throughout this whole period, we're undergoing like a process of continuous refinement. So what do I mean by that? So I'll give you a couple of examples. So in the very first prototype, we kind of had this little boat that took them to the island. But where'd the boat come from? How did they even learn how to sail? You know, like they're just two children. And the boat would be kind of this vessel that would carry them through this like celestial environment from garden to garden. But it didn't make a lot of sense, really. Like, you know, they're just two kids. It's a sailboat. Pretty complicated things. And it didn't tie back into the real world. Like, we don't know where it came from or any of that sort of stuff. So we started looking at, let's just put doors in the level. So every level, they'll just like step out of a door at the start of the level and finish the level by stepping into a door. This is like, you know, a bit of a video game hack that you could do to explain the whole system. But it kind of falls a bit flat. It doesn't tie into the greater story. Like, if they're just coming out of a door, why don't they just turn around and go home? Like, there needs to be like a greater challenge and a greater solution. So one of the early ideas we had was to have a cubby house that they run away from, they hide in, and it's the cubby house that transports them to the world and through the world, and then eventually back home again. So this idea eventually evolved into their tree house, which is actually like this really beautiful kind of metaphor for, you know, like this was their safe space, the place they ran to. It's where they might go to escape troubles, and it's where they like travel through all these memories and share this experience together. And also the metaphor is kind of like too good to pass up as well. Like, did they ever really leave the treehouse? A bit like in Alice in Wonderland, you know, does she ever really go down the rabbit hole, and not like everyone in the rabbit hole was also at the garden party? Kind of leave that up to the player to decide and think about. The other element we had early on was the fire. So you could burn a rope and you could get fire and lose fire. And we started codifying these elements so that we could reuse them throughout the game. So we have like sources and sinks. So like a source would be an igniter that gives you fire, or a sink, like you walk under a waterfall and you lose the fire. We had like little checkpoints, so when you take the fire to it, it becomes like a checkpoint you can go back to get the fire from again if you lose it. And this is all great for like kind of reusing puzzle elements and like building out our puzzle ideas. And fire has all these like really lovely properties as well. Like, everyone kind of understands how it works. Like, we all know how fire works, right? It's really, really simple. But there's a few big problems. First of all, we're using two parts of fire. We're using the light to like clear away darkness, but we're also using the heat to burn things. And then what happens at the end once you set fire to all these gardens effectively? And how does it contribute towards the end goal once you've, you know, lit a fire on every garden? And how does it tie back to the celestial elements and the constellations that we had as well? So in the end, we kind of like just scrapped the fire part and just went with light, which meant we had to kind of redesign how all the different elements in the games worked. So we started looking at like, we have like flowers that give you light, and when you ring chimes, the flowers will open and close. And we had to like recodify like how checkpoints work and all these different things. But it had this really nice, beautiful connection to the celestial element, like the light representing friendship, and you're carrying it through the gardens, and you're lighting up constellations to like preserve memories and communicate that story. So it fit really nicely, and has like a really early kind of example of some of the elements that we had in our gardens that, you know, got better and prettier and evolved over time, further and further.
Okay, let's take a deep dive into the deep drain, one of the particular gardens in the game. We're just going to have a look at how that was put together. So as we said, we had the key story beats, the structure for the overall story. This was the beat about the time Arena and Frent start exploring the drains behind their house, being a bit naughty, going where they're not meant to. And Arena accidentally loses her jacket down the drain. Frent then consoles her and is the emotional support that helps her through that experience. When we started thinking about how to turn that story idea into gameplay, we liked the idea that things could fall into the drain, and then you could rewind time and pull them back out. And you could use that to your advantage. Say maybe you would send something down to collect the light at the bottom of the drain and bring it back out. And we had to come up with this notation system for developing these ideas, because as humans, we only experience time moving forward. We're never used to the idea that timelines can be separated or changed or mutated or branched. So to think about how this content gets put together is really hard, and to think that you could take something from the future and bring it back to the past is really complicated. So in this example, you don't have to fully understand this, by the way. It's not important, there's no test. But each timeline, each object is represented by one line. So on the left, is the start of the timeline for that character, and on the right is the end of the timeline in the scene. So the top line is the two heroes, French and Arena, who don't separate in this garden. And the markers along the way are the objects that they might interact with as they go through the scene. And then there's a few other objects in the scene that are important. The second bottom one, for example, is a lighthouse that can be rotated. And when the light of the lighthouse shines on something, it is interacting with that object. And in this case, it's a platform vine, we call it. So when the light shines on the vine, the platform falls into the drain. And then as you rewind time, it will come back out of the drain. We liked the idea, but it had lots of issues. Sorry, I'll go back one sec. You could accidentally solve this because the solution was happening off screen down the drain. The solutions would sometimes happen by accident and you wouldn't even know you'd done it. And then it would come back out and be solved and be like, what the hell happened? Which is obviously really unfortunate game design. And it was really simple. There was no real reason to go down the drain twice. We did like that there was a big drain, and we did like that things were falling into it. We spent weeks coming up with all these complicated graphs and figuring out how all these different things could interact. Again, won't go into detail. But needless to say, the final solution is very complicated. That is 1/3 of the final notation graph for the final puzzle that's in the game that we shipped. This is the second iteration, and it's interesting because we really wanted to bring the jacket back in. The first example didn't have the jacket. The whole story beat was missing. So we came up with this idea that Arena would jump on a pipe, it would knock a rock that would fall into the water, and then that rock would be a stepping stone for Frent to get across. But you'd have to then reverse time and knock a second rock into the water. And by doing so, if you jumped on the pipe a second time, not only would the second rock fall down, but the jacket would also fall. And the player was then forced to accept that to progress in the game, they would have to also knock the jacket. And it was a way of connecting the experience of the player to the experience of Arena, where you would have to accept and come to terms with the fact that you wouldn't be able to rescue the jacket. And as a memory, you can't really change it. So it's just kind of like, it is what it is. When we brought that to the art team, they were like, no way, hell no. Not working with that, that is ugly. And here's all the notes that they had. They had lots of ideas about how to improve the jumping on the pipe situation. For example, they came up with the idea of the tap being turned on and that putting water on top of a rock. And Frent couldn't jump across the rock when the water's running. But as soon as you turn the water off, the tap off, the water stops, he's able to jump across. But because the water's not running through the pipe, a blockage forms somewhere else, and the jacket in the background is knocked out of the pipe that the water now comes out of instead. And so it's another way of changing that equation. And that is the final garden that now ships in the game. But I wanted to talk about this because it's an example of iteration on the large scale, where this took us probably like 2 to 3 months in total to develop the game. It's a lot of work. Just to get a single version running and be able to be playable is weeks of work. But absolutely worth it to get it right and to find the solution. Effectively, you can't experience something until you have it in context, until you can play it and see it exactly as it stands. And this brought us to the lesson that there was ways to codify making beautiful levels. So what makes a great looking level? Well, it starts with a simple composition, using the familiar kind of believable structures that we know in real life, where you would have a supportive wide base and things stacked on top to form that conical shape. Makes it more believable and easy to follow. And at the top of each island would be the center object, and all the lines of the conical shape are pointing towards the center. This is all taking inspiration from Japanese rock gardens, and the artists were using this as a bit of a cheat sheet to make things look aesthetically pleasing. So the Japanese rock gardens called, I'll butcher this, Kare Sansui, I hope. They have these natural cell-like structures and branch-like shapes, and they're aesthetically pleasing from any angle. And we were using that as a way to make our gardens pretty. So that meant when we brought a garden to the art team, we'd already applied all these concepts. Instead of having rocks randomly placed everywhere and it was just a mess, they had to reorganize it. We brought them something that was easier to work with. And that streamlined the whole process drastically. An important thing here is that the natural and familiar believable structures of the rocks, the way they're arranged, is a juxtaposition with the larger-than-life object, and that is what actually gives it the surreal experience. You have the believable, familiar, and real juxtaposed with the out-of-place, unexpected. And that's partly where the game gets its meaning.
Yeah. So what are some of the key things we've learned throughout this process, and and like what can we teach you today about the things that we went through. So the first element I'd like to talk about is like considered design. So I think our general design approach is to break something down, simplify it into all its parts so you can understand it, and then rebuild it in a way that makes sense for you. So a good example of this would be when we were taking the game from console to touchscreens. We needed to work out how to replace the joystick. Right? I think on-screen joysticks are pretty bad for a few reasons, chiefly because it's just an abstraction of an abstraction. Like a joystick is already an abstract kind of way of controlling something. And then also when you take it to a touchscreen, you lose all the good things about joysticks. Like you lose the hard limits, the self-centering, you lose all the really tactile feel. So how can we break that down into the different components and understand how we can build that for our game in like a way that makes sense and is better? So we started looking at all the different things we can do. On a screen, obviously, you can have a lot more feedback. You can have animation, so you can like show movement a lot better than you can with a physical joystick, which is really nice. So I started looking at how we can like send waves to the side of the screen. The example at the top there is like having little marching ants to communicate motion as well. We started like mocking this up in game and seeing how it might look in our style. And we built a few of these as well. There's some other prototypes you can see on the right there, like an original time slider, like almost going back to our very, very first prototypes. But ultimately, this is the design that we ended up with after all this iteration. So you have like the larger circle that shrinks down, so it's just communicating like the limits of a joystick. You have like a crisp horizontal line, because in our game there's only two directions, it's left and right. It's not like a 360-degree joystick. And then we have like the marching ants, like to communicate the motion and direction as well. So I think like this actually works really nicely, and it is the correct way for our game. It's obviously not going to be the right answer for every game, but I think through following that process, yeah, you can come up with good ways of designing your own things.
So obviously the talk is all about how we were trying to iterate on the big concepts like the story, the art, the characters, and going through huge iterations that take many, many months. But also want to talk about a small example, a small detail in the game that was iterated on as fast as possible. So this is a graph making tool we built to be able to generate graphs to make rumbles. So on-screen actions on the Switch have associated sound effects and also rumble effects, so the whole device shakes and should shake exactly in time with what's happening on screen. To do that, though, you need to make these graphs. You could potentially use sound effects as well, but being someone who doesn't know how to make sound effects, this was my solution. And you could basically create the graph and then add modulations to it to make it a little bit more of a natural form, add randomness. And as soon as you've got these graphs, you have to make 4 of them, by the way, for a single rumble, so it takes a while. You then need to get it onto the device to experience it, because again, you can't experience something unless it's in context and see how it relates to everything else. But to do that is like a 20-minute turnaround, and as a creative person, that just ruins your flow. Whatever idea you're experimenting with and wondering if this is going to work, 20 minutes later, you've kind of forgotten it. You're out of the flow. So it was important to get this iteration down as quickly as possible. We managed to get it down to 2 seconds. What happens is you press save, it automatically exports to your computer. Your computer acts as a web server, and by the time you've picked up the device, the debug version of the game is polling the server every 2 seconds to ask for the new files, and just constantly downloads the files every 2 seconds, just like repeatedly. So by the time you've picked it up, it's already got the latest rumbles. So you could experience it instantly, and that meant that you could iterate on these hundreds of times in the time you would normally get only one. Absolutely critical to getting that exactly right. And tools, we find, generally are basically never wasted. A lot of words to say something very simple there. But this is an example of us having our camera tools. So Arena and Frent walk on splines through the scene, right? And as they walk along that spline, they might walk into a zone, and shown in the red there that's selected. That red zone is a camera effect area. And you can position it anywhere along the spline easily and change the size of it, change the effect, the amount of effect it has on the camera. You can change any detail, like where it's looking, where it's positioned or tracking from, the field of view, all the details. And it all happens live in the editor, so you can constantly change it. It was absolutely critical for getting the experience right, because effectively in our game, the camera is a third character. It is so important to the way we tell the story, because composition, layout, focus, that is all what directs the eye for the player and helps them keep along with what's going on and helps them know what's important. Absolutely critical for us to get this game right.
Yeah, so talking about key learnings, so we've got iterate a lot, really consider your designs. Time spent tools is never time wasted. But also you need to understand what's important about your game and invest in it. So like to throw back to Notre Dame, they would have had world-leading sensors throughout the building. Like the scientists would have iterated on that and tested it and put it through like very rigorous scientific testing. But that no one tested the design panel, like the actual human interface of it. They would have been much better served by like working on that design instead of like just having, you know, like cheap Bunnings sensors in the tower instead of like crazy world advanced ones.
Le Bunnings.
Yeah, Le Bunnings. Yeah, so from how we applied this to our game, I guess, is understanding what was important to the Gardens Between early on, and that was like art and story. So Henrik did a really good job of like bringing together a team of like a talented artist and a writer, and like really investing in that and like iterating on it until we got the story right, until we had like all the different parts of the game fitting together. I think my favorite quote is by Antoine de Saint-Marche, someone, which is basically like your design's not finished until you can remove everything that can be removed. And I think throughout this process, that's kind of what we're doing. Is like we prototype and add stuff, and the game grows, and we're like, okay, this isn't good, this isn't good, this isn't good, and then what's left, we iterate and build on that, and like continuously remove stuff until only like the really good parts are left. Yeah, so thank you for listening.